It was an ordinary afternoon when Agent Maya Richards, a dedicated FBI agent, was deep in the heart of a city that was anything but ordinary. Her assignment was crucial, and though her life had always been about handling high-pressure situations, this one felt different. Maya was a black woman, and although she had proven herself countless times in the field, today's operation was no exception to the challenges that often came with being a minority in law enforcement. She was parked in a quiet area, watching a building that was rumored to be a hotspot for illegal activities. Maya had been working undercover for weeks, blending in with the crowd, gathering information without drawing any attention to herself. She was meticulous in her work, every move calculated, every detail important. Today, however, something felt off. The air seemed thicker than usual, and the hairs on the back of her neck stood up. It was as if she could sense that something was about to go wrong. Maya's phone buzzed with a message from her partner, Agent Tyler. "Everything clear on your end." She quickly typed back, "All quiet, just waiting for the next move." Just as she set the phone down, the sound of tires screeching caught her attention. A patrol car pulled up, a little too fast, with sirens blaring. She turned her head slightly, trying to remain inconspicuous, but her heart started racing. Not now, she thought. She had a mission to complete, and this was not the time for distractions. The officer who stepped out of the patrol car had an unmistakable air of authority about him. His uniform was crisp, and his stride was sharp. His eyes scanned the area, then landed directly on Maya. She had always been careful about her appearance during undercover missions, dressed in plain clothes, no obvious signs that she was anything other than just another person walking through the neighborhood. But something about the officer's gaze seemed to pierce through the facade she had carefully constructed. Maya remained calm. She was an experienced agent, and this was not the first time she had encountered a situation like this. However, as the officer walked toward her, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was different about this encounter. Maybe it was his posture, maybe it was the way he was looking at her, as though he already knew who she was. "Hey, what are you doing here?" The officer's voice cut through the stillness. It wasn't a casual question, it was an accusation. Maya took a deep breath, maintaining her composure, and responded, "I'm just waiting for a friend." The officer didn't seem convinced. His eyes narrowed, and he stepped closer, not allowing her any space. Maya's instincts told her that he wasn't just suspicious. He was ready to escalate the situation. Without hesitation, he reached for his radio and called for backup. "I've got a situation here," he said into the microphone, his words laced with suspicion. "Need a unit to assist." Maya's heart raced. She knew what was coming next. She had to stay calm, but the tension in her chest was unbearable. This wasn't just any routine encounter. This officer was looking for trouble. He wasn't interested in asking questions or listening to the truth. Maya's mind quickly went over her options, but before she could act, the officer took a step closer, his hand now on her arm. "You're coming with me," he said firmly, already starting to pull her toward his patrol car. Maya's mind raced. Was he serious? Did he really think he could arrest her without cause? She flashed her badge and identified herself as an FBI agent, but instead of backing off, the officer just looked at her with an expression of disbelief, as if he didn't believe her, as if her word didn't matter. This wasn't just an arrest, it was something much bigger. Maya knew it, and despite her calm exterior, inside, a storm was brewing. She had to stay calm. She had to stay in control. But how could she do that when everything around her was about to change in ways she could never have imagined? Maya felt the officer's grip tighten on her arm as he led her toward the patrol car. The weight of the situation settled heavily on her chest, but she refused to show any fear. Instead, she stayed calm and focused, knowing that every move she made could determine how this moment would unfold. "Let go of me," she said, trying to free herself from his hold. The officer, however, wasn't listening. His face remained stoic, almost mechanical. He wasn't concerned with her side of the story. All that mattered to him was that she, in his eyes, was guilty of something. He just wasn't sure what yet. Maya's mind was racing. Was this how it would end? Would her career be reduced to a simple mistake made by a racist officer? She couldn't allow that to happen. Not after everything she had worked for. Not after years of dedication to her job and to the principles of justice. She had seen plenty of prejudice in her career, but never had it been this direct, this blatant. "Ma'am, you're under arrest," the officer said, his voice flat, as if this was all just another part of his routine. He didn't even bother to check her identification or acknowledge her FBI credentials beyond the brief glance. To him, it didn't matter. Maya took a deep breath. She could feel the anger rising inside her, but she knew better than to give in to it. Instead, she repeated, "I'm an FBI agent. You're making a mistake." Still, the officer didn't react. His hand was firm on her arm as he guided her toward the back of the patrol car. She could feel the eyes of passing pedestrians on them, some of them confused, others looking away quickly. Maya's heart pounded in her chest, but she couldn't let herself break. Not now. She had to think. She had to stay composed, no matter how wrong this entire situation was. As she was pushed into the back seat of the patrol car, Maya caught a glimpse of the officer's face through the rear window. He was talking into his radio, not a hint of doubt in his expression. It was as though she was a criminal in his eyes, and no amount of explanation could change that. Her thoughts turned to her partner, Agent Tyler. She knew he would be searching for her soon, trying to make contact. He had to know something was wrong, and when he did, he would stop at nothing to make sure she wasn't just a pawn in some twisted game. But Maya had no idea how long that would take. She couldn't just sit and wait for help. She needed to act. As the patrol car drove away, Maya's mind raced. She needed to stay calm, but she also needed a way out. She thought about her options. Should she call her superior directly, or wait for her team to show up? She knew her colleagues had access to her location through their tracking systems, but it wasn't enough to guarantee her freedom just yet. Not in a situation like this. She needed to take control. The ride to the police station felt like an eternity. Each second dragged on, and every turn in the car seemed to bring her further away from the life she had built as an agent. But she wasn't ready to give up, not when she knew what was at stake. This wasn't just about her career anymore. This was about standing up against injustice, no matter how difficult it might be. As the car slowed to a stop, Maya knew that her ordeal was just beginning. The officer who had taken her in would soon realize that he had underestimated her. He had made a huge mistake by thinking she was just another person he could push around. Maya was stronger than that. She would fight to make sure that the truth came to light. The moment the patrol car came to a stop, Maya could feel her heart pounding harder than ever. Her mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, yet she forced herself to focus. She couldn't afford to lose her cool now. This was far from over, and she knew it. The officer who had arrested her still didn't believe she was an FBI agent, but she wasn't about to back down. The officer opened the door and stepped out first, walking around to Maya's side of the car. He opened the door, grabbed her by the arm, and yanked her to her feet. She didn't resist, not because she was afraid, but because she didn't want to escalate things further. She could feel the eyes of bystanders following the scene, some whispering among themselves, but Maya kept her composure. She wasn't going to let this officer get the best of her. "Come on," the officer muttered, his voice cold. He led her through the entrance of the police station. The building was stark and impersonal, and the fluorescent lights overhead hummed as if they were judging her for being there. Maya was no stranger to police stations. She had been involved in countless cases, often working closely with local law enforcement. But this time, things were different. This time, she was the one being treated like a criminal. Inside the station, a few officers looked up from their desks, giving Maya only passing glances. No one seemed to care much about her presence, though she was well aware that they were all waiting to see what would happen next. The officer who had arrested her pushed her toward a holding area. She could feel the eyes of others on her, the quiet murmurs that seemed to echo through the hall. She wasn't just an FBI agent now. She was the object of gossip, the subject of judgment. As she was led into a small, dimly lit room, the officer shut the door behind them. The room was bare, with only a small metal bench against the wall. Maya took a seat, keeping her posture straight. She wasn't going to let herself look defeated, even though she was far from what she wanted to be in that moment. The officer left her there without a word, and for a brief moment, Maya was alone with her thoughts. Her mind raced, trying to piece together how she had gotten to this point. She had been doing everything by the book, staying within the law, following the procedure. She was supposed to be making a difference, not sitting in a holding cell for something she didn't even do. She thought about her colleagues, her team, back at the FBI. They must have realized by now that something was wrong. Agent Tyler was no doubt already trying to find her, contacting anyone who could help. But Maya couldn't rely on that. She couldn't wait for them to rescue her. She had to be the one to take control. The minutes dragged on, and Maya's frustration started to build. This wasn't just about her personal freedom. It was about something much bigger. She had worked hard to get to where she was. She had spent years proving herself, battling against stereotypes and expectations, all while staying focused on the work. And now she was facing a racist officer who had decided to arrest her based solely on the color of her skin, disregarding her badge, her credentials, and everything she had worked for. But Maya wasn't someone who gave up easily. She had been through tough situations before. She had fought for justice, and now she would fight for her own. She wasn't going to let this officer, or anyone, take away what she had earned. It wasn't just about clearing her name. It was about standing up to the system that allowed such discrimination to exist. The door opened again, and the officer walked back in, this time with another officer in tow. They were both looking at her, sizing her up. Maya knew this was her moment to make a stand. She stood up, looked them both in the eye, and said, "You're making a mistake, and you'll regret it." Her voice was steady, but there was an undeniable fire behind her words. She wasn't backing down. Not now. The room felt colder now, despite the rising tension in Maya's chest. She had made her stand, but it didn't seem to make a difference to the officers standing before her. The one who had initially arrested her still looked at her with suspicion, his arms crossed, eyes narrowed. The other officer, a younger man, watched her curiously, unsure of what was really going on. Maya didn't flinch. She had dealt with adversity before, but this moment felt different. It was one thing to fight for justice in a courtroom or in an investigation, but this was personal. She could feel the weight of the injustice pressing down on her, but she refused to let it break her. As she stood there, the door to the room opened again. A tall man walked in, wearing a suit and carrying an air of authority. Maya recognized him immediately. It was Captain Miller, one of the higher-ranking officers in the station. She had crossed paths with him a few times in the past, but their interactions had always been brief and professional. This, however, was different. The moment he entered the room, his eyes locked onto Maya, and he froze for a moment. His gaze softened, though it was clear he was taking in the situation carefully. "Agent Richards," Captain Miller said, his voice calm, but with an underlying seriousness. "What's going on here?" Maya didn't waste a second. She stepped forward and quickly explained the situation. She recounted how she had been falsely arrested, how she had identified herself as an FBI agent, and how the officer had ignored her credentials. She could feel the frustration building again, but she kept her voice steady, unwilling to let herself be rattled any further. Captain Miller listened intently. He didn't interrupt, just nodded along as she spoke. When she finished, he turned to the officer who had arrested her. "What's your side of the story?" he asked, his tone colder now. The officer seemed caught off guard by the question, as if he hadn't expected anyone to question his actions. He stammered for a moment, looking to the younger officer for support. I saw her acting suspiciously," he said, his voice trailing off. Suspiciously. That was the excuse. Maya could hardly believe it. She had been doing her job, nothing more. But in the eyes of the officer, her very presence was enough to raise doubts. His biases had taken over, and now he was scrambling for a justification. Captain Miller turned his attention back to Maya. "I'll make sure this is looked into," he said firmly. "You're free to go, Agent Richards. I'll have the situation handled." Maya felt a mix of relief and anger. On one hand, she was being released, but on the other, it was hard to shake the feeling that this situation could easily be swept under the rug. It wasn't just about her freedom anymore. It was about the bigger issue of systemic bias within the force. She couldn't let it slide. She had to make sure this wasn't forgotten, that this officer would face the consequences for his actions. As the officers began to move toward the door, Maya stood her ground. She wasn't just going to walk away and forget about what had happened. "Captain Miller," she said, her voice steady, but with an edge, "I appreciate you clearing this up for me. But I need to know, what are you going to do about Officer Daniels? He can't just get away with treating people like this." Captain Miller hesitated for a moment. His eyes flickered to the officer in question, then back to Maya. "We'll investigate, Agent. I promise you that." But Maya wasn't satisfied. She had seen too many promises made and broken before. She needed to be sure that this would be taken seriously, that no one else would have to go through what she had just experienced. As she walked out of the room, her mind was already working on what to do next. She wasn't just going to let this go. It was time to take a stand, not just for herself, but for everyone who had been wronged. Maya walked out of the station, feeling the weight of the day still heavy on her shoulders. Even though she had been released and cleared of any wrongdoing, the anger inside her hadn't faded. The officer who had arrested her, Officer Daniels, had gotten off easy. His behavior had been unacceptable, and she couldn't just let it go. There were too many others who might find themselves in the same position, treated unfairly because of someone else's biases. She pulled out her phone and quickly called Agent Tyler. She needed someone to talk to, someone who understood what she was going through. After a few rings, Tyler picked up. "Maya, where are you?" Tyler's voice was full of concern. "I'm out, but I'm not done yet," Maya replied, her voice determined. "I've been thinking about what happened, and it's not just about me anymore. This is bigger than just one arrest." Tyler stayed silent for a moment, processing her words. "What do you mean?" "I need to take action, Tyler. Officer Daniels can't just walk away from this. He has to be held accountable for what he did. He made assumptions about me based on my appearance, and that's not something we can ignore," Maya explained, frustration creeping into her voice. Tyler agreed, knowing Maya was right. "You're not wrong, but we both know how tough it's going to be to get anyone to act on this. It's not easy to fight the system from the inside." Maya sighed but wasn't ready to back down. "I know, but I'm not going to wait for someone else to fix this. I'm going to make sure this doesn't go unnoticed. We can't let his actions just be brushed aside." Tyler knew Maya's resolve. She had always been driven, never one to let anything slide. "What's your plan?" "I'm going to gather evidence. I'll start by talking to the people who were there, the ones who saw what happened. I'm sure there are witnesses. I'll get as much as I can, then go from there," Maya replied. "But I'm going to need your help. You know how to navigate the channels and make sure the right people get the information." Tyler hesitated for a moment. "Are you sure you want to go down this path? You're putting yourself at risk. Not everyone will be on your side." Maya smiled, though there was a hint of sadness in it. "I've been taking risks my whole life, Tyler. I didn't sign up for this job to back down when it gets hard. This is the moment I've been waiting for, to make a real change." Tyler couldn't argue with that. He knew Maya well enough to understand that once she set her mind to something, there was no stopping her. "All right, let's do this. I'm in." Maya ended the call, feeling a little lighter. She wasn't alone in this fight. She had her partner by her side, and together, they could make a difference. But she also knew this would be a long road. There were people who would resist, who would try to silence her, but she wouldn't let them. Not this time. The next few days were a blur of phone calls, meetings, and interviews with anyone who might have seen the encounter with Officer Daniels. Maya tracked down the people who had been nearby when she was arrested, asking them about what they had witnessed. It wasn't easy, and some were hesitant to speak up, but slowly, piece by piece, she started to gather enough evidence to build a case. One day, she managed to track down a woman who had been walking her dog near the police station when the arrest took place. The woman, a local teacher, was hesitant at first, but eventually agreed to talk. "I saw everything," the woman said, her voice quiet but firm. "I saw how he treated you, how he wouldn't even listen when you tried to explain yourself. It wasn't right." Maya took down her statement, feeling a sense of relief. The woman's testimony could be a key piece of evidence in the case against Officer Daniels. As the days passed, Maya continued to dig deeper, not just for herself, but for anyone who had been mistreated by law enforcement because of their race. She was gathering the pieces of a puzzle that, once put together, would show the world the truth. And no matter how long it took, Maya was determined to see it through to the end. The pressure was mounting, but Maya refused to back down. With every day that passed, she gathered more pieces of the puzzle: witness statements, video footage from nearby cameras, and even photos of the area where she had been arrested. Each new bit of evidence brought her closer to the truth, but also closer to the reality of how deep the problem ran. Officer Daniels was not just a single bad apple. His actions were a reflection of something much larger, something that had been allowed to persist far too long. Maya had kept her head down at work, sticking to her cases while secretly pursuing her investigation into Daniels. But she knew she couldn't keep working in silence forever. She needed to bring her findings to someone who could actually make a change, someone who had the power to do something about it. She reached out to Captain Miller again, hoping he would take her seriously. When he agreed to meet with her, Maya felt a small sense of relief. But she also knew she had to be strategic. This wasn't just about Daniels anymore. This was about exposing the truth, about making sure that officers who used their power for prejudice and bias wouldn't be allowed to continue unchecked. The day of the meeting arrived, and Maya sat across from Captain Miller in his office. The walls around them were lined with certificates and commendations, but Maya was focused on the conversation at hand. "Agent Richards, what's this about?" Captain Miller asked, looking at her with curiosity. "I've gathered everything you need," Maya replied. "Witness statements, footage, and everything else. This officer, Daniels, he abused his position, treated me as though I was guilty simply because of the way I look. He didn't even consider the possibility that I might be telling the truth." Miller listened attentively as Maya laid out everything she had found. The witnesses who had seen the arrest, the teacher who had agreed to testify, the footage from the nearby store security camera. Everything painted a clear picture of what had happened that day. After Maya finished speaking, Miller leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled in front of his face. "This is serious, Agent Richards," he said quietly. "But I need to be certain. We can't move forward unless we have the evidence to back up everything you've said." Maya nodded. "I understand. That's why I've collected everything I could, so we can make sure this doesn't get swept under the rug." Miller was quiet for a moment, clearly processing the situation. Finally, he spoke, his voice heavy. "All right, I'll start the investigation. But be prepared, Agent Richards. You've seen how this goes. Not everyone is going to be on our side." Maya's heart sank a little. She knew Miller was right. The system wasn't always fair, and there would be people who would resist the truth. But she also knew this was a fight worth having. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for anyone who had ever been treated unfairly because of their race. She couldn't let Officer Daniels, and anyone like him, get away with it. "I'm ready," Maya said firmly. "I've come this far. I'm not stopping now." Miller gave her a long look, a mixture of respect and concern in his eyes. "Then let's make sure we do this right." As Maya left the meeting, her determination burned brighter than ever. She had the support she needed, and now It was time to let the investigation unfold. She knew there would be obstacles ahead, but she had faced challenges before, and this one wasn't going to stop her. The next few weeks passed in a blur as Maya continued to gather more evidence and worked with Captain Miller's team to build the case. She was relentless, making sure that every detail was accounted for, every witness statement verified. Slowly, she began to see results. The investigation into Officer Daniels was gaining momentum. There was talk of suspension, of potential disciplinary actions, and for the first time, Maya allowed herself to believe that justice might actually be possible. But despite the progress, Maya couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The system that allowed officers like Daniels to act with impunity was still in place. If she wanted to make a real difference, she would have to go further. She couldn't just stop at one officer. She needed to help root out the bias that ran deep in the system. For now, she kept her focus on Daniels. But as she worked tirelessly, Maya knew she was laying the foundation for something bigger. The fight for justice had only just begun. The tension in the air was palpable as Maya entered the conference room. She had been waiting for this moment, the day when the investigation into Officer Daniels would come to a head. She had worked tirelessly to gather evidence, and now it was time for the truth to be heard. But even as she walked into the room, she couldn't shake the feeling of unease. The stakes were high, and she knew this wasn't going to be an easy battle. Captain Miller was already sitting at the head of the table, his eyes scanning through the reports. He looked up when Maya walked in and gave her a small nod of acknowledgement. Behind him, a few other officers sat, waiting for the meeting to begin. Maya's heart beat a little faster. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about showing everyone that justice mattered, no matter how difficult it might be to achieve. Agent Richards, Miller began, his voice steady but carrying the weight of the situation. We've gathered all the evidence. It's time to make the next move. Maya nodded, her eyes fixed on the room full of officers. She had worked alongside most of them before, but today they weren't her colleagues. They were part of the system that she was trying to change. She needed them to understand the importance of this moment, to see that this wasn't just about one officer, but about sending a message that bias in law enforcement couldn't be tolerated. I've reviewed all the testimonies and video footage, Miller continued. The evidence is clear. Officer Daniels violated protocol, and there's no question that his actions were based on bias. Maya could feel the weight of his words, but they didn't bring her relief. Instead, they made the fight feel even more real. The truth was out, but now, the difficult part began. Officer Daniels was still a member of the force, and the question remained, would he be held accountable? I'm recommending immediate suspension, Miller said, his gaze shifting to the other officers in the room. An internal investigation will follow, and depending on the outcome, further action may be taken. Maya's pulse quickened. Suspension was a step in the right direction, but it wasn't enough. She knew the system had a way of protecting its own, and Officer Daniels might be able to slide by with a temporary punishment. That wasn't good enough for her, and it wasn't good enough for the people who had witnessed what happened that day. I appreciate the steps that are being taken, Maya said, her voice calm but firm, but suspension isn't enough. We need to make sure this doesn't happen again. I want to see this investigation through to the end. I want to make sure that Officer Daniels faces the consequences of his actions, no matter how high up the chain he is. Miller's eyes met hers, and for a moment, there was a quiet understanding between them. He knew that Maya wasn't just speaking for herself. She was speaking for everyone who had ever been unfairly treated by the system. She was speaking for the people who had been ignored or dismissed because of their race, their background, or their status. I understand, Agent Richards, Miller said. I'll make sure this investigation goes as far as it needs to. We'll ensure the right steps are taken. The room was quiet as everyone absorbed the gravity of the conversation. Maya felt a surge of hope, but it was tempered with the realization that the fight was far from over. She had taken one step forward, but the journey ahead was long. She wasn't just fighting for one officer's punishment. She was fighting for a change in the system, a change that would make law enforcement truly just for everyone. As the meeting ended, Maya walked out of the room with her head held high. She had spoken up, and now it was up to the rest of them to do what was right. She knew it wouldn't be easy, and there would be more battles ahead, but for the first time in a long while, she felt a sense of accomplishment. This wasn't just about getting justice for herself. It was about making a real impact, one that would be felt far beyond the walls of that meeting room. But she knew this was just the beginning. There would be more fights to fight, more wrongs to right. And Maya was ready for whatever came next. She had already proven that nothing could stop her from standing up for what was right. The days following the meeting felt like a blur. Maya had done everything she could to ensure Officer Daniels would face the consequences of his actions. The investigation was moving forward, but the reality of how difficult it would be to truly make a difference hung over her like a heavy cloud. The system she had always been a part of wasn't perfect, and it didn't always move as fast as she wanted. Still, she couldn't stop now. Not when she had come so far. Captain Miller had promised to keep her updated, and Maya trusted him. Yet she couldn't help but feel restless. She spent the next few days focused on her work, but her mind was constantly on the case. Was Daniels going to be held accountable? Would things actually change, or would it all fade away like so many issues before? It wasn't until one afternoon that she received a call that made her stop everything. It was from Captain Miller. "Maya, I need you to come in," he said, his voice serious. "We've got something important to discuss." Her heart raced. "What's going on?" "I think you'll want to hear it in person," Miller replied. Maya's mind raced as she drove to the station, her thoughts filled with a mix of hope and uncertainty. Was this it? Was the investigation finally going to make a difference? When she arrived, she was immediately ushered into a meeting room. Captain Miller was there, along with a few other officers whom Maya recognized but didn't know well. As she sat down, Miller wasted no time. "We've completed the investigation into Officer Daniels," he began, "and I want to tell you that we're taking action. After reviewing all the evidence and witness statements, we're moving forward with disciplinary measures." Maya's heart skipped a beat, but she knew better than to celebrate too soon. She had heard promises before. What kind of measures? Miller looked at her, his face serious. "Daniels will be suspended indefinitely, and we're recommending termination. His actions were unacceptable, and we won't tolerate it. This isn't just about the arrest you experienced. It's about the bigger issue. We want to make sure nothing like this happens again." Maya felt a wave of relief wash over her. For the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to believe that real change was possible. Daniels wasn't just being brushed aside. His actions had consequences, and while it wasn't a perfect solution, it was a start. "I appreciate this, Captain," Maya said, her voice steady. "But it's not just about Daniels. It's about making sure this doesn't happen to anyone else. We need to keep pushing for change, not just with one officer, but with the whole system." Miller nodded. "You're right, Agent Richards. We have to keep working to make sure this doesn't happen again. But I want you to know this. Your efforts have made a difference. This investigation wouldn't have gone as far as it did without your persistence. You've set an example for everyone here." Maya felt a sense of pride swell within her. She hadn't done this for the recognition, but it was still rewarding to hear that her actions were making an impact. As she left the meeting room, Maya's thoughts were filled with a mixture of satisfaction and determination. She had fought for justice, and while this was just one step, it was a significant one. Officer Daniels was being held accountable, and that was something that had rarely happened in the past. But Maya knew the work was far from over. There were still many officers like Daniels who needed to be confronted, and there were still many people who would continue to face injustice simply because of their race. Maya wasn't done yet. She had proven that change was possible, and now she was determined to continue pushing for it. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but Maya was ready. She had shown that one person could make a difference, and that thought fueled her as she walked out of the station, knowing she was on the right path. With every step, she was helping to build a better future, one where fairness and justice truly prevailed.